The year is 1400. You stand your watch on the walls of Sivas, a city under the shadow of a coming storm. The air is cold, tasting of dust and dread. For weeks, you have heard the whispers. They travel with merchants, flee with refugees, and seep into the prayers of the desperate. They speak of a conqueror from the eastern steppes, a man whose name is spoken in hushed, trembling tones, Tamerlane. They say he does not just defeat armies, he erases them. They say cities that resist him are not simply captured, but unmade, their buildings torn down to the last stone, their populations vanished, their very names scratched from the record of the world. They spake of rivers diverted by corpses, and of towers built not from brick, but from human skulls, left to bleach in the sun as his final signature on a landscape of death. You try not to believe it. Such tales must be exaggerated, the fearful imaginations of those who have never seen real war. You are a soldier. You know the grim but limited logic of battle. You fight. You win or lose. You negotiate. You live or die. There are rules, even in chaos. Now, as the first faint stain of his dust cloud appears on the eastern horizon, that fragile certainty crumbles. The cloud grows, darkening the skyline. It is not just an army, it is a migration of destruction. Thousands upon thousands of men, horses, and siege engines, moving with a terrible unified purpose. The ground itself begins to tremble beneath your feet. Beside you, an older veteran, a man who survived a dozen campaigns, crosses himself. You see it in his eyes, raw, undisguised terror. He believes the stories. And in that moment, so do you. Inside the city, panic is a living thing, coiling through the streets. Women gather children and flee toward the citadel. Smiths work through the night, the frantic clang of hammer on metal, a feudal anthem of defiance. Your commanders pace the walls, their faces etched with a calculation that is no good answer. The siege begins not with a dramatic parley, but with a silent, chilling efficiency. His engineers do not simply surround you, they weave a cage. Deep trenches are dug to prevent any escape. Sharpened stakes face outward. Siege towers, taller than your walls, creep forward like walking giants. There is no grand challenge, no offer of single combat. This is not a duel of honor. It is the beginning of a mechanical process, as methodical as a butcher preparing his tools. For days you hold. Arrows darken the sky. Stones from catapults smash against the walls. Your fellow soldiers fall, and there is no time to mourn. You fight because there is nothing else to do. But with each passing hour, the truth becomes clearer. Their numbers are endless. Your arrows grow scarce. The section of the wall to your left is crumbling. Hope is not fading, it is being systematically dismantled, stone by stone, life by life. Then a pause. The relentless assault stops. An unnatural quiet falls, broken only by the moans of the wounded. From the enemy lines, a single rider approaches under a flag of truce. He does not shout. He carries a sealed message for your commander. The debate in the command hall lasts through the night. You hear the raised voices from outside. Some argue for a glorious, final stand to die with weapons in hand, to enter history as martyrs. Others, their voices cracked with exhaustion, speak of the people inside, the families, the children, the elderly who cannot hold a sword. They speak of the conqueror's offer. It is a public oath, sworn on his honor and before his gods. Lay down your arms. Open your gates. Submit to my authority, and I swear, not one drop of your blood shall be spilled. It is a specific, sacred promise. In your world, such an oath is a bond stronger than any chain. To break it would damn him in this life and the next. Perhaps some whisper, this is the exception. Perhaps this time mercy is the more cunning strategy. Perhaps he wishes to be seen as a ruler, not just a destroyer. Dawn arrives with a verdict. Despair and the frail hope for life have won. The order is given. The great iron minus-banded gates of Sivas, which had held for so long, creak open. You lay your sword on the growing pile, feeling its cold weight leave your hand. A hollow emptiness takes its place. You walk out, blinking in the morning light, a disarmed man amidst thousands of disarmed men. For a few hours it seems the promise will hold. You are counted, grouped, but not bound. No violence comes. A grim relief passes through the ranks. We chose correctly, you think. We live. Then, the orders change. You are marched not into the city, but away from it, into the open plain. There, you see the ditches. Not shallow graves, but in orous, sprawling trenches, freshly dug, as if the earth itself has opened dark mouths. The scale is all wrong for burial. A cold comprehension, slower and more terrible than any sword stroke, dawns on the crowd. It begins as a murmur, then a ripple of panic. The conqueror's soldiers, their faces impassive. From a tightening ring around you, there spears a forest of cold steel. He is keeping his word. Not a drop of blood will be spilled. The first shovels of dirt hit the living men at the edges of the pit. The screaming starts not the battle cries of warriors, but the raw, animal terror of trapped souls. You are pushed forward. The world shrinks to the churning earth. The cacophony of screams, the weight of bodies pressing you down. The soil fills your mouth, your nose, your eyes. The last thing you know is the darkness, absolute and suffocating, and the profound, grotesque understanding that he was, in the most literal and monstrous sense, a man of his word. This is not a legend. This is history. This happened in Sivas in the year 1400, and for the man who gave the order, it was not an act of rage. It was a deliberate, calculated lesson. The first chapter in a textbook of terror written across a continent. His name was Tamerlane, and this was only the beginning. To dismiss Tamerlane as a mere psychopath or a force of nature is to misunderstand you entirely. His true genius lay in system minus building. He did not just inflict terror, he engineered a self-sustaining ecosystem of fear that conquered lands long before his armies arrived. This system rested on three interconnected pillars: reputation, precision, and spectacle. The currency of reputation before the internet or mass media. Information traveled through merchants, refugees, and spies. Tamerlane mastered this primitive network. He understood that a story, once unleashed, would grow in the telling. The massacre at Sivas wasn't just a punishment, it was a seed. The specific, twisted cleverness of the act, the technical adherence to an oath while committing atrocity, made the story irresistible and unforgettable. It would be repeated in every caravanserai from Anatolia to India. By the time his army approached the next city, its leaders weren't just facing soldiers, they were facing a fully formed nightmare narrative. This reputation became a weapon that set morale, divided councils, and often delivered bloodless surrenders. His fame was a force multiplier. The precision of the lesson, his cruelties were not random. Each was a tailored message for a specific audience. Sivas was a lesson on semantics and power, teaching that his word was law, but his interpretations were fatal. The coming destruction of Urgench would be a lesson on Arasur, showing that rebellion could lead not just to death, but to oblivion. Isfahan would become a lesson on ingratitude and scale, demonstrating the cost of betraying his mercy. Delhi would illustrate total domination, humiliating a civilization's symbols of power. Baghdad's fate would finalize the doctrine of statistical extermination. Each horror was a distinct chapter in a grim curriculum designed to be studied by future enemies. The spectacle as policy, the skull towers, the pyramids of heads, the systematic planting of barley over ruins. These were not the acts of a man hiding his crimes. They were public monuments, deliberately constructed to be witnessed. They were the medieval equivalent of a viral campaign. A traveler seeing a tower of 1,500 skulls would carry that image across continents. These spectacles made the abstract numbers of the dead terrifyingly concrete. They bypassed rational political calculation and struck directly at the limbic brain, triggering primal, paralyzing fear. The goal was to make resistance seem not just futile, but cosmically absurd, like arguing with an earthquake. This ecosystem allowed Tamerlane to operate with chilling efficiency. The fear he cultivated did the hard work of conquest, breaking wills and fracturing alliances before a single arrow was loosed. He was not merely a warrior, he was a master propagandist and psychological operations director. Centuries ahead of his time. 3 years before Sivas, Tamerlane had already authored a definitive text on his philosophy of power in the city of Urgench. If Sivas was a lesson in deceptive language, Urgench was a seminar in existential negation. Urgench modern minus Dakoni e minus Urgench. Turkmenistan was no minor outpost. It was the glorious capital of Khrezm, a Silk Road nexus of staggering wealth. Its libraries held millennia of knowledge, its architects had designed minarets that seemed to scratch the heavens, its markets flowed with spices, silks, and ideas from China to the Mediterranean. It was a living repository of Persian culture and Islamic learning. Initially, Urgench submitted to Tamerlane, but when his back was turned, the city rebelled, aligning with the rival. In Tamerlane's calculus, This was the ultimate sin. A city that chose him and then recanted was not just an enemy, it was a traitor to his newfound order. A flaw in the fabric of his empire that demanded not correction, but excision. His return in 1388 was not a military campaign. It was a surgical removal. The siege was swift and brutal. Once the walls fell, the systematic deconstruction began, executed with a bureaucratic coldness that is perhaps the most frightening aspect. Phase 1: the unminus creation of life. The order was total slaughter. Chroniclers describe a city drowning in its own blood. But this was the chaotic frenzy of a sacking. It was methodical. Districts were cleared house minus by minus house. Distinctions of age, gender, or status were irrelevant. The goal was the elimination of the living memory of Urgench, the poets, the scholars, the artisans, the mothers, the children who would remember the city as it was. The population was not killed en masse in the fields. They were eradicated within their own homes, streets, and mosques, so that the very stones of the city would be saturated with the evidence of their end. Phase 2: the unminus creation of place. With the people gone, Tamerlane turned on the city's body. He ordered the complete and utter physical demolition of Urgench. This was an immense, deliberate labor. Soldiers and enslaved prisoners spent weeks, possibly months, on this task. They did not just burn or topple buildings. They were instructed to dismantle them. Grand mosques were pulled apart brick by precious brick. Palaces were reduced to foundations. Libraries with their irreplaceable manuscripts were burned, the ashes scattered. The irrigation canals that fed the city's lush gardens were shattered. The goal was to leave not a single structure standing above head minus height. He was reversing centuries of human endeavor, returning urban complexity to flat, sterile ruin. Phase 3: the symbolic finale, the barley field. Then came the iconic, almost mythical, final act. Historians debate its literal truth, but its symbolic power is undeniable. Tamerlane is said to have ordered the ruins to be plowed and sown with barley. Consider the profound symbolism. Barley is the crop of peasants of anonymous, fertile fields. By sowing it over the heart of a majestic capital, Tamerlane was making a metaphysical statement. He was re-stoning reality. He was decrying that this was no longer a place of history, culture, or identity. It was now agricultural land. The past was not just defeated, it was rendered null and void, its very soil repurposed. It was the ultimate act of erasure, a message to the world: I do not just conquer, I unmake. I can reduce the greatest jewel to a farmer's plot, and your civilization is just a season away from being forgotten. The effect was permanent. While a settlement later arose nearby, the great, ancient Urgench never recovered. Its site became a ghostly plain. Tamerlane had proven he could delete a city from the map, not through neglect, but through focused, apocalyptic will. The lesson for every other metropolis on the Silk Road was clear: submission might be temporary survival, but rebellion was permanent oblivion. Isfahan's story presents the darkest question in Tamerlane's world. What was the fate of those who were granted mercy and then dared to reclaim their dignity? In 1387, the legendary Persian city of Isfahan, the center of art, theology, and science, made the rational choice. Faced with Tamerlane's approach, its leaders opened their gates. They offered no resistance. In return, Tamerlane displayed what passed for clemency. He installed a governor, imposed a heavy war tax, and departed. Life, though subjugated, continued. The city breathed. Then, the spark of resentment ignited. The tax was crushing, the occupation humiliating. The people at Isfahan, perhaps believing Tamerlane was too distant or too preoccupied, rose up. They killed the Mongol governor and his garrison. It was an act of desperate defiance. When news reached Tamerlane, his response was not anger, but what a modern psychologist might call cold, narcissistic rage. The rebellion was not a military problem, it was a profound personal insult. They had rejected his gift of their lives. This betrayal could not be answered with mere reconquest. It required a corrective so monumental, so mathematically terrifying, that it would freeze the heart of any future subject. His return was swift. What followed was not a battle but an administrative extermination. The quieter system Tamerlane issued an order that transformed massacre from an act of war into a bureaucratic imperative. Each company or unit in his army was given a numerical quota of severed heads they were required to produce. This was not a vague incitement to violence, it was a specific, accountable target. Soldiers became hunters, not warriors. Their success was no longer measured by territory taken, but by a gruesome body count. This simple directive weaponized human nature. It created peer pressure among the troops to exceed the quota. It eliminated any hesitation or mercy. A soldier wondering if a crying woman or a hiding child should be spared now had a direct, careerist incentive not to. The unit's honor and perhaps its safety from their own commander's wrath depended on meeting the number. The harvest. The soldiers of Tamerlane's army fell out through the streets of Isfahan. This was not a chaotic riot. It was a systematic harvest. Doors were broken down. Hiding places were ferreted out. People were dragged from mosques, cellars, and attics. The chronicles describe a city transformed into an abattoir. The air grew thick with the metallic smell of blood and the panic of a doomed populace. The killing continued for days until the quotas were met and likely exceeded. Modern estimates suggested toll between 70,000 and 200,000. The architecture of memory. But Tamerlane was not done. The heads themselves were valuable not as trophies, but as building materials. He ordered the construction of skull towers, minarets of heads at major intersections and city gates. Imagine the engineering of horror soldiers stacking human heads, like grisly bricks, mixing mortar to hold the structure of death together. Persian and Arab historians, men like Ahmad ibn Arab Shah who lived in his shadow, documented these towers with numb dread. One chronicler attempted to count them, noting 28 towers before becoming too ill to continue, estimating each contained 1,500 skulls. The numbers may be symbolic, but the physical and psychological reality is not. These towers were not hidden. They were public infrastructure of terror. They served a clear purpose. For the conquered they were a daily, inescapable reminder of the cost of defiance, a monument to their own dead that could not be mourned or buried. For travelers, merchants, diplomats, and pilgrims would carry the image across the world, becoming unwilling agents of Tamerlane's propaganda. For future enemies they were a tangible, visceral argument for surrender. Why fight a man who turns people into architecture? Isfahan's lesson was taught by mercy is a one-time offer. To reject it is to choose not just death, but to become the literal cornerstone of your city's shame. I will not just kill you, I will inventory you, and use you to warn the next generation. The skull towers of Isfahan stood for decades, slowly weathering, a decaying testament to a moment when human life was converted into a unit of account and a medium for construction. The message was received, and it echoed through the centuries. By 1398, Tamerlane was in his 60s, an old man by the standards of his time. Most conquerors might have settled into ruling their hard-1 empires, but Tamerlane's engine was fueled not by a desire for administration, but by the pure, unquenchable thrill of conquest and the tangible wealth it brought. His gaze now fell upon the fabled, dripping riches of the Indians of continent, specifically the Delhi Sultanate. His official pretext was religious. He claimed the Muslim sultans of Delhi were too lenient on their Hindu subjects, and he, as a defender of the faith, would correct this. It was a thin veneer of piety over a campaign of naked plunder. Tamerlane's own empire was pragmatically multi-ethnic multi-religious. His true god was power, and his true scripture was written in loot. The campaign south was not a march but a spreading conflagration. His army moved like a locust swarm, stripping the land bare. Villages were burned for tactical effect and for terror. Crops were destroyed to create a desert for his enemies and a dependency for his own train. And they took prisoners, so many prisoners. By the time they neared Delhi, chronicles suggest they had amassed a staggering 100,000 captives, mostly Hindu civilians and soldiers from earlier skirmishes. This human mass presented a severe logistical problem. They consumed resources and required heavy guarding. More critically, on the eve of a decisive battle, they were a potential fifth column, a threat waiting to erupt behind his lines. Tamerlane's solution was not born of strategic genius, but of a chillingly simple calculus of cruelty. He gave the order for their systematic execution. In a single, methodical day of slaughter, an estimated 100,000 unarmed, bound prisoners were put to the sword. Historian Ahmad ibn Arab Shah, no friends of Tamerlane, described the scene. The ground became a quagmire of blood and earth, a mud so thick it stalled men and horses. This was not a battle. It was an industrial scale clearing of an inconvenience, the prelude performed with the cold efficiency of a clerk balancing a ledger of death. In came the main event. On December 17, 1398, Tamerlane faced, the main army of Sultan Mahmud Teudo outside Delhi. The Sultan held what he believed to be an unstoppable weapon: 120 armored war elephants. These were not mere animals, they were medieval battle tanks. Clad in chainmail with swords fixed to their tusks and howdahs carrying archers on their backs, they were designed to shatter infantry formations, unsow unimaginable panic. Tamerlane, however, had done his reconnaissance. He countered biological terror with psychological warfare. His plan was audacious and terrifying in its own right. According to accounts, he ordered his men to gather straw and brush, load it onto his baggage camels, and then set the terrified, bunting animals on a stampede directly toward the elephant corps. Imagine the scene from the elephant's perspective: a wave of shrieking, living fire rushing toward you. The instinct to flee overrode all training. The mighty elephants, symbols of royal and divine power in India, wheeled in terror. They crashed back through the Sultan's own meticulously arranged ranks, trampling hundreds of men, dissolving order into chaos before the battle had even properly joined. Tamerlane's cavalry then charged into the confusion, turning a potential defeat into a rout. Delhi's fate was sealed. What followed was a 5-day orchestrated apocalypse. Tamerlane gave his troops the freedom of the city as their reward, but the ensuing violence was anything but chaotic. It followed a pattern of systematic erasure, mirroring Urgench but on a vastly grander scale. The killing soldiers moved through wealthy districts and slums alike. Mosques and temples offered no sanctuary. The Conqueror Sheriff administered an all-SD road of streets so choked with corpses that movement was impossible. Of vultures grown too fat to fly. The scale was so vast that survivors later claimed the stench of decay forced the abandonment of the city center for months. The plunder, the looting was meticulous. The wealth of generations, gold, gems, silks, spices was hauled away. Artisans, weavers, masons, and scholars were not killed but enslaved and marched back to Samarkand to beautify Tamerlane's capital with their skills. The intellectual and cultural wealth of Delhi was physically transported away. The humiliation, this was the masterstroke. Tamerlane captured 90 of the Sultan's surviving war elephants. He did not kill these magnificent, expensive creatures. Instead, he put them to work. He chained them and forced them, the ultimate symbols of Indian royal power, to haul massive blocks of stone and loot over 1,000 miles back to his capital Samarkand. There they would be used to construct his grandest mosque, the weaponized. The message was layered and profound: your gods are powerless. Your king's might is now my beast of burden. Your greatest symbols will build monuments to my glory. Delhi was left a smoking, desolate shell. Its revival took over a century. The trauma entered the subcontinent's sculptural memory, a wound that never fully healed. Tamerlane had demonstrated that he could not only destroy a city but could also strip a civilization of its pride, repurposing its sacred icons into tools for his own legacy. After Delhi, one might wonder what escalation was left. Tamerlane founded in Baghdad, a city of transcendent symbolic weight. As the former seat of the Caliphate, the round city was the historical and spiritual heart of the Islamic world, a beacon of law, philosophy, and science. Tamerlane had conquered Baghdad before, in 1393, and it had submitted. But in 1401, while he was campaigning elsewhere, its former ruler retook it. This was more than rebellion, it was an ideological challenge, a reassertion of a legacy that predated and perhaps claimed to outrank his own. For Tamerlane, the master of messages, this required a final, definitive response, a statement so horrific it would settle the argument for all time. The siege of 1401 was brutal. After 40 days the walls fell. And then Tamerlane implemented his most coldly bureaucratic and psychologically devastating protocol, yet the universal head quota. He issued an order that every soldier in his army, from general to foot soldier, was produce a minimum of 2 severed human heads. Failure would mean the soldier's own head would fill the quota. This was the Isfahan system weaponized to its absolute extreme. It transformed his entire army into a frenzied, competitive killing machine with a mathematically guaranteed outcome. The effect was catastrophic logic in action. It removed all restraint, mercy, or pragmatism. Sparing a useful artisan became a fatal liability. A living prisoner was a wasted opportunity, only a head counted toward the mandatory total. They created a self-driving genocide. Soldiers could not wait for orders or identify rebels. They had to proactively hunt. Distinctions between combatant and civilian, man and woman, adult and child, or irrelevant abstractions. A head was a head. It bred absolute terror, even among the killers. Some chroniclers, like the Arab historian Ibn Poland, who actually met Tamerlane, recorded rumors that soldiers, unable to find enough victims, began killing their own captives or even their own captains or even their camp followers to meet the impossible demand. The system's internal logic was so powerful, it threatened to consume itself. The streets of Baghdad became a charnel house of unimaginable efficiency. Death toll estimates vary from 20,000 to 90,000, but the number is almost secondary to the chilling method a city systematically processed to meet a production target. Then, as in Isfahan, the harvest was assembled. The heads were collected not for disposal but for construction. Skull towers were built again, but the scale reported is mind-numbing. Some sources claim 120 towers were erected at the city's gates, bridges, and major intersections. Even if the number is symbolic, the intent was a physical and psychological occupation of the city's space with the fact of its own annihilation. Amidst this carnage, Tamerlane made one deliberate exception. He spared most major mosques and shrines. This was not mercy. It was the final, nuanced stroke his message. By destroying every secular center of power, every library, every market, and every home, but leaving the houses of worship standing amid a forest of skull towers, he made his point with terrifying clarity. I am not at war with your God. I am at war with you. Your faith cannot save your city, your culture, or your life. Your obedience belongs to me in this world. The next is your own concern. Baghdad was shattered. Its role as the central capital of the Islamic world never recovered. The center of gravity shifted permanently. Tamerlane had taken on history itself and left a monument of skulls as his reply. Tamerlane died in 1405, in the midst of planning an invasion of China. His empire, stretched taut over thousands of miles and cemented only by fear, began to unravel almost immediately. His descendants fought bitterly over the spoils, and within a few generations the Timurid Empire had fractured. Unlike the empires of Rome or China, he built no enduring administrative structures, no legal codes that outlived him. His legacy was not a system of governance, but a folklore of terror and a mountain of bones. So did he fail? In the long span of history, his political creation was ephemeral. But in the realm of memory and human psychology, he achieved a dark immortality. He proved the terrifying potential of psychological warfare. It demonstrated that calibrated, spectacular atrocity could be a more effective tool than conventional military force alone. He was a master of what we now call information operations, weaponizing narrative and trauma to win campaigns without fighting. He exposed the fragility of civilization. Urgench, Delhi, Baghdad, these were not backwaters. They were pinnacles of human achievement, rich with knowledge, art, and layered history. Tamerlane proved that such edifices could be reduced to dust and barley fields by a single will armed with relentless cruelty. He embodied the ever-present historical truth that the line between a golden age and a mass grave could be shockingly thin. He personalized the abstract scale of death. The skull towers are the ultimate symbol of this. A chronicler can write he killed 70,000, and the number slides off the modern mind. But the image of a tower built from 1,500 individual skulls, each one a person with a face, a story, a fear, forces a confrontation with the human reality behind the statistic. He made death architectural and inescapable. Today we remember him. Historians debate his motives and his exact toll. Central Asian nations wrestle with his complex legacy as both a brutal conqueror and a national figure. His name is invoked as a synonym for cataclysmic destruction. In the end, Tamerlane's story is a grim lesson in the darkest potentials of human agency. It shows us that brilliance and culture are no armor against a mind devoted to domination, and that history's deepest shadows are not cast by natural disasters, but by men who look upon the world and see only clay to be shattered, and bones to be used as bricks. He built towers not to reach heaven, but to ensure that the world would never forget the price of looking him in the eye. To view Tamerlane solely through the lens of battlefield cruelty is to see only the flash of the blade, and not the immense, grinding mechanism that powered its swing. His empire of fear was not sustained by rage alone, but by a formidable and often overlooked foundation and masterful command of logistics, economics, and information. He was as much a CEO of conquest as he was its chief executioner. The mobile metropolis, Tamerlane's army was not just a fighting force, it was a migrating city-state. Chronicles described a camp so vast and organized, it could house hundreds of thousands of soldiers, slaves, artisans, merchants, and bureaucrats. Its mobile capital, pulsing with its own economy, had several strategic advantages. Self-sufficiency, it could operate for extended periods far from traditional supply lines. Artisans repaired weapons and armor on minus sight. Vast herds of livestock traveled with the army. Psychological dominance, the sight of this endless, orderly sea of tents and banners was itself a weapon of intimidation, a visual representation of limitless power and permanence. The administrative control decisions could be made and orders relayed from the very heart of the campaign. Spies, scouts, and diplomats reported directly to the source of power. The economy of plunder. Terror was the strategy, but loot was the fuel. Tamerlane understood that an army marches on its stomach and its greed. His campaigns were meticulously planned to target the wealthiest nodes of the Silk Road, not just for destruction, but for extraction. Systematic stripping, the plunder of cities like Delhi and Isfahan was not random looting. Specialized officers, perhaps early precursors to quartermasters, were tasked with identifying and cataloging the most valuable items, libraries of illuminated manuscripts, relics, architectural pieces, and rare materials. This was mere theft, it was the relocation of cultural and economic capital to a center of power in Samarkand. The human resource, the enslavement of artisans, scholars, engineers, and beautiful women was a coldly pragmatic policy. These individuals were not just spoils, they were a transfusion of talent. They would build his mosques, paint his palaces, advance his science, and bear his children, enriching his dynasty's gene pool and cultural prestige. He was harvesting human capital, the intelligence network. Fear cannot be targeted without precise information. Tamerlane maintained an extensive network of spies, scouts, and informants that stretched far ahead of his armies. Pre-minus campaign reconnaissance. He knew the strength of garrisons, the political divisions within city councils, the location of granaries, and the mood of the populace long before arriving. This allowed him to tailor his approach, offering the choice to Sivas, or preparing the specific camel tactic for Del his elephants. Post-minus atrocity messaging. After an event like the Skull Towers of Isfahan, his agents would ensure the story spread along trade routes with specific chilling details. The horror was curated and broadcast. The bureaucracy of brutality. The headquarters of Isfahan and Baghdad revealed the most chilling aspect, the bureaucraticity of atrocity. Tamerlane's administration could tabulate, assign, and verify grisly quotas. It suggests a level of record minus keeping middle management devoted to mass murder. It was cruelty stripped of passion, reduced to quarterly targets and performance reviews for murder. This transition from hot minus blooded slaughter to cold, administrative extermination is perhaps his most sinister legacy, a grim foreshadowing of the horrors of the 20th century. History is written by the victors and shaped by the traumatized. To understand the true depth of Tamerlane's impact, we must step away from the strategic maps and body counts, and into the shattered mental landscape of those who survived. The survivor's psyche. Imagine you are a young scholar in Baghdad who hid in a well as the quota hunches passed. You emerge to a city transformed. The air smells of smoke and decay. Familiar landmarks are gone, replaced by grotesque new towers that hum with flies. Your teacher, your friends, your family, they are not just dead, they have become part of the city's new, dreadful architecture. Your world has not just been conquered, it has been inverted. The places of learning and prayer stand isolated amidst monuments to their failure to protect you. The trauma is not just personal grief, it is a cosmic disorientation, a rupture in the order of the universe. Trust in authority, faith in divine protection, the very continuity of history, all are annihilated. The cultural amnesia and the broken chain. In Urgench and elsewhere, Tamerlane didn't just kill people, he killed transmission. The master calligrapher died with his untaught style. The astronomer was slain with his unpublished observations. The engineer was killed before he could pass on the secret of an ark's construction. Libraries, those reservoirs of collective memory, were ash. This created gaps in cultural and scientific lineage from which regions took centuries to recover, if they ever did. The destruction was a form of intellectual lobotomy performed on civilizations. The economy of trauma. Beyond the immediate plunder, the economic shockwave was generational. Trade routes, carefully cultivated over centuries, were severed or shifted in terror. Farmers were dead or enslaved, fields lay fallow or worse altered. the complex web of credit, trust, and mercantile relationships that fueled the Silk Road economy was torn apart. Poverty and famine followed the armies, killing far more than the sword in the years that followed. A city like Delhi didn't just lose its wealth, it lost its ability to generate wealth for 100 years. The poison gift of Timur Ica. In the core of his empire, particularly in his beloved Samarkand, Tamerlane presided over a cultural flowering. He brought the greatest architects, poets, and scientists from conquered lands to build a glittering capital. But this Timurid renaissance was built on a foundation of screams. Every beautiful tile in the Bibi-Kanwaya mosque, every line of poetry composed in his court, every advancement in the observatory was paid for with the blood of Isfahan, the ashes of Urgench, and the enslaved labor of Delhi's artisans. It was a stark, brutal illustration that one civilization's golden age can be directly financed by the apocalypse of another. This duality, the aesthete and the exterminator, remains the central, unsettling paradox of his character. Tamerlane did not fade into a dusty footnote. His ghost has haunted the historical imagination for 6 centuries, morphing from a historical figure into a symbol, a warning, and a perverse source of fascination. In literature and art, Christopher Marlowe Esler's Babethan plate Amberline, the great 1587 raids formed him into a towering, immoral force of nature, speaking in bombastic verse about his thirst for rain. This portrayal cemented his image in the Western mind as the archetype of the limitless, ambitious tyrant. He appears in operas, poems, and novels, often as a personification of uncontrollable, destructive will a human earthquake. In political rhetoric and propaganda, leaders have long invoked Tamerlane as a comparative benchmark for terror. Soviet historiography alternately vilified him as a feudal monster and later rehabilitated him as a nation-minus builder for Central Asian republics. In modern times, his name and image are sometimes weaponized in regional politics, a ready-made symbol of brutal strength or tragic victimhood depending on the narrator's need. In the science of violence, modern military strategists and historians of genocide study Tamerlane's campaigns. His use of psychological warfare, his understanding of the symbolic power of spectacle, the Scold Hours as medieval psychological operations, and his systematic, quota-driven massacres of grim case studies. He provides a pre-modern blueprint for how to use terror not as a byproduct of war, but as its primary weapon. The chilling efficiency of his brutality forces uncomfortable questions about the linear progression of civilized warfare. The archaeological shadow. Even the earth bears witness. The sites of his destruction present unique archaeological profiles, sudden, catastrophic layers of ash, weapons, and bones, often with no evidence of rebuilding for generations. The potential location of the Scold Hours, if ever definitively found, would be a site of unparalleled macabre historical significance, a physical testament to his method. The unanswered question. Ultimately, Tamerlane endures because he represents a terrifying answer to a fundamental human question: what are the absolute limits of one person's will to power? His life argues that the limits are frighteningly few, provided that will is coupled with brilliant organization, absolute ruthlessness, and a willingness to transform human beings into abstract units of labor, of plunder, or of architectural material. He forces us to confront an arc thread in the human tapestry, but the drive to build glorious monuments, and the drive to commit colossal atrocities can emanate from the same source. He is the dark twin of the great civilization minus builder, a reminder that our capacity for creation is forever shadowed by our capacity for annihilation. We remember him not to glorify his horrors, but because to forget them is to forget a crucial, terrible truth about the world we have built, and the fragile walls that separate order from the abyss. To understand the monster, one must first understand the forge that created him. Tamerlane's story begins not in a palace, but in the fractured, brutal world of the 14th century Chagatai Khanate, a remnant of Genghis Khan's empire in Central Asia. He was born in 1336 near the city of Kesh, later Shah as Abz, into the Barlas tribe, a Mongol clan that had adopted Turkic language and Islamic faith. His given name was Timur, meaning iron. The epithet Lang the Lame, later Europeanized to Tamerlane, came from arrow wounds to his right leg and hand sustained in his youth, which left him with a lifelong painful limp and a paralyzed right arm. This physical vulnerability in a world that worshipped martial prowess likely forged in him a ferocious will to dominate through intellect and strategy, compensating for what his body lacked. His early life was a masterclass in realpolitik. The political landscape was a chaotic chessboard of nomadic tribes, decaying city-states, and warlords. There was no clear throne to inherit, only power to seize. Timur began as a minor chieftain, a bandit leader of modest following. His genius lay in his ability to weave alliances, betray them at the perfect moment, and absorb the forces of defeated rivals. He operated not as a king claiming divine right, but as the most cunning, unruthless player in a deadly game. A pivotal and characteristically duplicitous early moment was his partnership with his brother Law, Emir Hussein. Together they overthrew the local ruler of Transoxiana. Once victory was secured, Timur turned on Hussein, besieging him in Balkh. After capturing him, Timur did not execute him personally. He allowed Hussein to be killed by vengeful rivals, while he himself mourned publicly a masterpiece, a political theater that removed a rival while maintaining an aura of honorable grief. This patterned strategic alliance, patient consolidation, then swift, total betrayal became the bedrock of his rise. By 1370, at a Qur Alta I tribal assembly in Balkh, he declared himself the rightful restorer of the Mongol Empire, but with a crucial twist. He was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. To legitimize his rule, he married a princess of Janghisid lineage, Sarim Alt-Khanum, and took the title Gorgen Son-Law. He ruled not as a great Khan himself, but through a series of puppet Khans of Janghisid blood, while he held the real power as a mere commander. This elaborate fiction showed his deep understanding of symbolic power and tradition. He was crafting a persona, the loyal servant of a glorious past, even as he was tearing the present apart to build his own future. This formative period reveals the core contradictions that would define him: a devout Muslim who slaughtered Muslim populations, by the city, a lover of art and philosophy who used human skulls. His Big's a man of intense personal loyalty to a small circle who betrayed broader alliances without a second thought. He was not a barbarian from the wilderness, he was a product of a sophisticated, crumbling world who mastered its rules only to shatter them under his own in blood and fire. What was it like to be a cog in this machine? To understand the scale of Tamerlane's operations, we must step into the boots of a soldier in his army, a force that was arguably the most effective military instrument of the medieval world, a blend of steppe tradition, Islamic discipline, and innovative engineering, organization and loyalty. The army was organized on the classic Mongol decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, but with tighter central control. Loyalty was ensured through a combination of shared Turkic-Mongol identity, the magnetic force of Tamerlane's successful leadership, success being the ultimate loyalty potion, and the lavish distribution of plunder. He cultivated a personal bond with his commanders, knowing them by name and sharing their hardships, while also instilling a terror of failure that matched any enemies. The siege train, while famed for his cavalry, Tamerlane's true innovation was his integrated siege corps. He traversed continents with a traveling factory of destruction. His engineers could construct prefabricated siege towers, massive catapults ranging IQ, and mobile protective sheds kept on site. During the siege of Smyrna 1402, he built a causeway of stones and logs across the harbor to assault the seaward walls. This technical prowess made no city, regardless of its fortifications, could feel safe. The message was clear: your walls are a delay, not a defense. Intelligence and deception. A soldier might be part of elaborate fights. Before a major battle, Tamerlane would often send out small, fast-moving detachments to raid and burn, creating a screen of smoke and confusion. He mastered the use of false retreats to draw enemy forces into ambushes. Rumors were deliberately spread about his army's size, his location, or his intent. For the common soldier, this created an atmosphere of constant movement and purposeful deception, where the broader strategy was invisible, but the trust in Timur's unpredictable genius was absolute. The psychology of the court. For those who participated in atrocities like the headquarters of Baghdad, the experience was psychologically complex. It transformed warfare from combat into a gruesome form of labor. The peer pressure within a unit to meet its number would have been immense. There are hints in chronicles of soldiers experiencing breakdowns or fierce, internal disputes over credits for kills. This system perverted the warrior's code, replacing honor with a macabre productivity metric. It also created a class of veterans inured to a level of brutality that would leave them permanently scarred and dangerous, a lingering social toxin discharged back into the empire. To serve in Tamerlane's army was to be part of something simultaneously magnificent and monstrous. It offered glory, wealth, and a sense of world-minus conquering destiny, but at the cost of participating in, and normalizing, acts of inhumanity on a scale the world had rarely seen. It was a forge that turned men into both the instruments and the embodiments of their master's terrifying will. Samarkand, under Tamerlane's direction, was to become the Rome of the East, a dazzling capital to showcase his power and taste. His project reveals the profound, unsettling contradiction at his core: the meticulous aesthete, who was also a master of mass slaughter. His building campaigns were an extension of his warfare by other means. The architectural vision: he did not simply rebuild Samarkand, he imagined it as the navel of the world. He constructed broad, or straight avenues, like the CYOB Bazaar lined with shops from across his empire. The Registan Square, though later perfected by his descendants, began as a civic center. His graced architectural testament, the BD-Conwayam Mosque, was intended to be the largest in the Islamic world, its agate invisible for miles. This construction, however, was rushed, using forced labor and materials from conquered lands, leading to structural problems that caused parts of it to collapse within his own lifetime, a symbolic reflection of an empire built fast on a foundation of violence. The court of scholars and poets Tamerlane actively patronized intellectuals, most notably the historian Sharaf ad-Din Ali Yazdi, who wrote the flattering Zafarnama Book of Victory. Astronomers like Ali Kushji worked at his observatory. He held debates in his court where theologians and philosophers from different schools would argue before him. This was not merely vanity. It was a display of enlightened kingship, a conscious effort to wrap up power in the silks of high culture. He wanted to be remembered not just as a conqueror but as a civilizer. The family man and the dynasty within his private circle, accounts suggest he could be affectionate and loyal. His deep lifelong attachment to his chief wife, Suraim ult Khanim, and his grief at the death of his sons and favored grandson, Muhammad Sultan, show a capacity for personal love. Yet this same man could order the massacre of thousands of families without apparent remorse. This dichotomy points to a radically circumscribed empathy. His moral universe was a series of concentric circles. Those within the innermost circle, family, close companions, his tribe, were fully human. Those in the next circle, his soldiers, subjects of his corlands, were instruments. Those outside these circles, the populations of resisting cities, were not merely enemies, they were raw material, abstractions to be used or removed. This psychological comportamentality is key to understanding how the patron of arts and the architect of genocide could reside in one mind. The failed succession: his ultimate failure was one of legacy. He spent his life building an empire for his dynasty, but he failed to create a stable system of succession. His grandsons, most notably the scholarly Ahmad al-Sultan, plunged into civil war almost immediately after his death. The empire fragmented, and within a century, his descendants were largely displaced by the Uzbek Shaybanids. The magnificent Samarkand was sacked in turn. This irony is profound. The man who obsessed over permanent monuments of stone and glory could not create a political structure that outlived his own terrifying presence. His true legacy was not a dynasty, but a legend, a cautionary tale of power so absolute, it could only destroy, not sustain.